Ladies and gentlemen, it is often said that life happens to us, that we are swept along by forces beyond our control. And yet, the truth is far more empowering. Life unfolds largely according to what we choose to cultivate within our own minds. If the mind is the soil, then thoughts are seeds. Some of these seeds bear fruits of courage, success and joy, others grow weeds of fear, doubt, and regret. The question we must ask ourselves is simple, yet profound: which seeds am I planting today? We are, in essence, the sum of our choices, especially the choices we make within the sanctuary of our own consciousness. Consider this: every action you take, every habit you form, begins first as a thought, a fleeting whisper in your mind. To master your life, you must first master that inner dialogue. You must speak deliberately to yourself, shaping your thoughts with intention, rather than letting them wander as unrestrained echoes. Imagination is not a mere escape, it is a forge, a workshop of the soul. When you vividly imagine the life you desire, not as a dream without foundation, but as a detailed, actionable vision, you give your mind a blueprint to follow. The man who sees himself as courageous will, over time, act courageously. The woman who imagines herself disciplined will cultivate habits that reflect that vision. Your imagination is the compass by which your choices align, guiding you toward the person you wish to become. Yet, the mastery of the mind requires responsibility. Freedom is not found in the absence of constraint, but in the acceptance of ownership. Every decision, every reaction, every belief is yours to steward. To blame circumstance, to wait for others to grant permission, is to surrender your power. Real freedom is the daily commitment to act as the architect of your own destiny. Transformation is rarely immediate. It is the result of persistent practice, the repeated choosing of thoughts, the gentle correction of false beliefs, the careful tending of your inner life. One cannot become who they wish in a single moment, but one can take a single thought and let it grow. Day by day, choice by choice, act by act. So, I invite you to take this truth seriously: you are what you choose to become. Your mind, when disciplined and intentionally guided, has the power to shape not only your character, but the very circumstances of your life. The question is no longer, what will happen to me? But rather, who will I become through the choices I make today? Master your mind, and in doing so, master your destiny. Your future is not written by accident. It is written by the thoughts you nurture, the imagination you exercise, and the courage with which you act. Begin now with awareness, with care, and with the unwavering knowledge that the power to become lies within you. The mind is the soil from which every aspect of life grows, yet few realize the depth of its influence. Each thought, no matter how fleeting, acts like a seed planted in that soil. Some seeds carry the potential for growth, for flourishing into strength, resilience, and success, while others are like weeds, silently taking root and choking the life out of our intentions. The power of thought is not abstract or mystical. It is profoundly practical and tangible. Every choice we make, every action we take, begins in the quiet, unseen chambers of our mind. Before we speak, before we act, before we even feel, there is thought, an origin point from which all else emerges. Understanding this is the first step toward mastering one's life. To ignore the quality of our thoughts is to leave our life's garden untended, to allow random seeds to grow unchecked, and to suffer the consequences of neglect. Thought is not merely the reflection of what exists, it is the architect of what will exist. When we repeatedly focus on fear, limitation, or doubt, we are, in effect, fertilizing the ground for experiences that mirror those thoughts. Conversely, when we cultivate thoughts of possibility, resilience, and purpose, we prepare the soil for achievements, growth, and fulfillment. The mind does not distinguish between imagined and real experiences when it comes to their influence on action. What it believes strongly enough, it moves toward. This does not mean life will always bend to our whims instantly or without effort, but it does mean that what dominates our inner dialogue determines the direction of our energy, decisions, and ultimately our reality. The careful nurturing of thought, therefore, is not indulgent daydreaming. It is the deliberate act of shaping one's life at the most fundamental level. Every moment presents an opportunity to choose the seeds we plant. In times of difficulty, we might be tempted to dwell on problems, to replay past mistakes, or to imagine the worst possible outcomes. These mental habits, though natural, are dangerous. Like invasive weeds, they grow rapidly, spreading their influence into actions, attitudes, and relationships. The individual who fails to master their thoughts becomes a passive observer of their own life, constantly reacting to circumstances rather than shaping them. In contrast, the person who recognizes the power of thought becomes an active cultivator, aware that even small, consistent mental choices compound over time into profound change. Just as a gardener does not abandon their plot after the first season of poor growth, we cannot abandon our minds to neglect. The patient, consistent planting of constructive, disciplined thoughts ultimately transforms both character and circumstance. Thoughts also have the remarkable ability to influence not only external outcomes but internal experience. Consider how the simple act of focusing on gratitude, hope, or determination can shift one's emotional state, even under challenging circumstances. The mind interprets and responds to the patterns it dwells upon. Repeated negative thought patterns lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and feelings of helplessness, while intentional positive patterns foster clarity, confidence, and emotional resilience. The cultivation of thought is therefore both a psychological and practical exercise. By choosing what we focus on, we can shape the lens through which we interpret life, which in turn affects the choices we make and the results we achieve. Moreover, the power of thought is cumulative. One positive or disciplined thought may not immediately produce noticeable change, but over weeks and months, the patterns become self-reinforcing. Habits, character traits, and even circumstances begin to align with the mental environment we nurture. This is why consistent awareness of thought is critical. It is not enough to occasionally think positively or imagine success. One must consistently return attention to the seeds planted, removing weeds of doubt and discouragement, and encouraging the growth of productive, life-affirming ideas. Over time, the mind becomes a fertile ground for achievement, purpose, and fulfillment, producing a harvest that aligns with the deliberate choices made within. In essence, the power of thought is the power to shape life itself. It is the invisible hand guiding behavior, the silent architect of reality, and the foundation upon which all progress is built. To master the mind is not to avoid difficulties or magically achieve desires, but to understand that the quality of one's inner life determines the quality of one's external life. Every thought, consciously nurtured or carelessly allowed, contributes to the ongoing construction of the self and the unfolding of circumstances. Recognizing this and acting with intention is the true beginning of personal mastery and meaningful achievement. Human beings have long been tempted to view themselves as victims of circumstance, as passive vessels carried along by the tides of environment, upbringing, or fortune. Yet such a view, though comforting in its simplicity, is profoundly misleading. While circumstances influence the canvas upon which life is painted, they do not determine the masterpiece that emerges. The brush lies in our own hands, guided by the choices we make in the quiet chambers of the mind. Each individual has the capacity to define themselves not by what has been done to them, but by how they respond, how they choose to think, and how they cultivate the inner life that shapes every outward action. Self-definition, therefore, is the deliberate and conscious act of taking responsibility for the person one is becoming. Circumstances, though real and often challenging, are merely external conditions. They do not possess the inherent power to define character, purpose, or destiny. A person may be born into poverty, face repeated failures, or endure unjust treatment, yet these conditions do not, in themselves, decide who that person will be. Instead, what decides is the response, the mental choices made in the face of adversity. When a mind chooses resilience over despair, focus over distraction, or courage over fear, it begins to shape identity. These choices accumulate moment by moment, thought by thought, into a self that is independent of circumstance. Life, in this sense, is less a matter of what happens to us and more a reflection of who we choose to become in response to what happens. Self-definition requires vigilance. Most people allow external events and opinions to unconsciously define them. They accept labels, limitations, and narratives imposed by society, peers, or even family, often without questioning whether these labels correspond to the person they truly wish to be. A careless acceptance of such definitions leads to a life lived under the authority of others, where identity is borrowed rather than created. In contrast, a conscious individual refuses to be defined by external conditions. Instead, they cultivate an inner standard, a personal vision of the self that transcends circumstance. By returning frequently to the question, "Who do I choose to become?" one begins to align daily decisions with this inner standard, and slowly, deliberately, a defined and authentic self emerges. The mind is the arena in which self-definition occurs. Thoughts, beliefs, and assumptions act as the foundation upon which identity is built. If one repeatedly thinks of oneself as powerless, inadequate, or destined to fail, the mind begins to act as if these ideas are true, and behaviors follow accordingly. Conversely, if one consistently chooses to see oneself as capable, resourceful, and worthy of growth, the mind begins to construct that reality. Self-definition is thus both an internal and external exercise. Internally, it is the careful nurturing of thoughts and beliefs. Externally, it is the conscious alignment of actions with these mental decisions. The individual who masters this process understands that identity is not a static fact, but a living, dynamic creation shaped by choice. Furthermore, the process of defining oneself is intimately tied to responsibility. To acknowledge that you are the product of your choices is to accept accountability for your life. It is easy to blame circumstances, other people, or luck for one's shortcomings. It is far more challenging and far more liberating to recognize that the mind is the ultimate source of empowerment. When a person accepts this responsibility, they cease to be at the mercy of circumstance and instead become the intentional architect of their own development. They learn that, while they cannot control every event in life, they can control their response, their interpretation, and the identity they cultivate through their choices. Self-definition also demands patience and persistence. One cannot redefine oneself overnight. The mind does not transform instantly. Rather, it is shaped gradually through repeated choices, disciplined reflection, and conscious alignment of action with vision. Each decision to act in accordance with a chosen self-image strengthens that identity, while each lapse weakens it. Over time, these repeated choices create a pattern that solidifies into character. What begins as deliberate effort eventually becomes instinct, and the individual begins to live as the person they have intentionally chosen to be, rather than as the passive product of circumstance. Self-definition is the cornerstone of personal mastery and meaningful achievement. It teaches that identity is not assigned, inherited, or accidental, but consciously constructed through mental choices. The life we live is, therefore, not merely a consequence of what happens to us, but a reflection of who we have chosen to become in our minds. By embracing this principle, by consistently choosing thoughts and actions aligned with our highest aspirations, we take ownership of our destiny. We are no longer passengers in the journey of life. We are the pilots, navigating according to the compass of deliberate, conscious choice. Conscious choice is the invisible engine behind every meaningful action. Few realize that before any accomplishment, every effort, or even every failure, there is a decision, a mental turning point where the mind either seizes control or yields to impulse. Life is not merely a sequence of events to endure. It is a series of choices, large and small, that collectively determine the trajectory of our existence. The act of deciding is therefore not a trivial moment. It is the pivotal opportunity to shape the self and the world. Yet many live reactively, allowing circumstances, emotions, or the opinions of others to dictate their actions. To live intentionally is to break free from this reactive pattern and to assert the sovereignty of the mind in every moment. The foundation of conscious choice is awareness. One cannot choose wisely without first noticing the thoughts and impulses that arise within. Often people act without reflection, responding automatically to habits or external pressures. These automatic responses, while seemingly minor, accumulate to shape character and destiny. By contrast, the individual who practices awareness pauses before acting, examines the impulse, and asks, "Does this choice align with the person I wish to become?" This pause, however brief, transforms action into an act of creation rather than a reflex of circumstance. Awareness illuminates the decision-making process, revealing that each choice carries the potential either to strengthen or to weaken the vision we hold of ourselves. Inner dialogue is the primary arena in which conscious choice is exercised. The thoughts we harbor, the questions we ask ourselves, and the interpretations we make all serve as a framework for decision-making. If the inner dialogue is dominated by doubt, fear, or negativity, the choices we make will inevitably reflect those limitations. Conversely, if the dialogue is deliberate, disciplined, and aligned with purpose, it guides behavior toward constructive outcomes. Mastery of the mind begins here with the recognition that the silent conversations within shape the visible life without. What one repeatedly tells oneself, what one repeatedly imagines and affirms, establishes the standard by which decisions are made. In this sense, conscious choice is not merely an external act, it is the deliberate cultivation of thought and belief, which then manifests in action. It is also essential to understand that conscious choice does not eliminate the challenges of life. Difficult circumstances, competing desires, and external pressures will always present themselves. The difference lies in how one responds. A conscious chooser evaluates options, weighs consequences, and selects actions that are consistent with long-term goals and values, rather than reacting impulsively or being swayed by temporary comfort or fear. This discernment, though subtle, accumulates into patterns of behavior that define character. Over time, the person who consistently chooses consciously develops self-discipline, resilience, and clarity because each choice reinforces the habit of intentional living. Furthermore, conscious choice is inherently empowering. When one recognizes that every outcome begins with a decision, one claims responsibility for life's direction. Blame for misfortune loses its grip. Excuses no longer dictate behavior. The awareness that action stems from choice transforms every moment into an opportunity for self-determination. Even when circumstances are beyond control, the choice of how to perceive, interpret, and respond remains firmly within the mind's authority. In this way, conscious choice is both liberating and practical, giving individuals the tools to navigate uncertainty, adversity, and complexity with clarity and purpose. Developing conscious choice requires practice and persistence. The mind is accustomed to automatic thought patterns, impulses, and conditioned responses. Changing this requires repeated attention, reflection, and effort. Daily exercises such as pausing before reacting, questioning assumptions, and affirming intentional beliefs gradually retrain the mind to act from choice rather than habit. Over time, decision-making becomes not only deliberate but almost instinctive, because the inner dialogue has been reshaped to prioritize purpose, clarity, and alignment with long-term vision. This is the essence of personal mastery, the ability to navigate life with intentionality, where each decision contributes to the construction of a meaningful and empowered existence. Finally, conscious choice demonstrates that power is never external, it is internal. The ability to define actions, to select responses, and to direct effort toward meaningful goals rests not in circumstance, wealth, or influence, but in the mind's capacity to choose. By mastering the inner dialogue and exercising deliberate decision-making, the individual becomes the architect of both character and life experience. This is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical principle that, when applied consistently, produces visible transformation. Every great accomplishment, every act of courage, every moment of personal growth begins with this simple, profound truth: action flows from decision, and decision flows from the mastery of thought. Imagination is often misunderstood as mere fantasy or idle daydreaming, a whimsical escape from the responsibilities of life. Yet, in truth, imagination is the most profound creative force a human being possesses. It is not a passive function of the mind, but an active instrument of transformation. Everything that exists in the physical world was first imagined. The architect envisions the building, the inventor conceives the device, the artist sees the masterpiece before it is born. Similarly, the life one desires, the person one wishes to become, and the achievements one longs for all begin in the fertile ground of imagination. To underestimate its power is to underestimate the very mechanism by which reality itself is formed. The imagination serves as a blueprint for action. When an individual vividly imagines a goal, a behavior, or a future self, they provide the mind with a clear pattern to follow. The brain, responding to these mental images, begins to align thought, emotion, and intention toward bringing that vision into being. This does not mean that imagining alone produces results without effort, but it means that the clarity of vision determines the efficiency and direction of effort. A person who has no clear idea of what they want is like a traveler setting out without a map. They may move, but they will wander. Imagination, therefore, functions as both compass and map, guiding decisions, motivating consistent action, and shaping the choices that lead to tangible outcomes. Moreover, imagination interacts with belief. The mind cannot distinguish with precision between what is vividly imagined and what is directly experienced, especially when the imagination is detailed and emotionally charged. When one consistently imagines a version of oneself as competent, resilient, and capable, the subconscious mind begins to accept this image as truth. Habits, reactions, and decisions gradually align with the imagined self, producing observable transformation over time. This process demonstrates that imagination is not idle or escapist. It is the laboratory of personal growth, where the potential of the mind is translated into the reality of character and circumstance. The creative power of imagination extends beyond the self to the external world. Every innovation, discovery, or societal advancement originates in a mind willing to envision what does not yet exist. Yet the same principle applies to personal life. To imagine a successful project, a meaningful relationship, or a healthy lifestyle is to plant seeds of possibility in the fertile soil of consciousness. The clarity and consistency of this mental cultivation determine the likelihood of its manifestation. Those who fail to exercise imagination deliberately often find themselves reacting to the world as it is, rather than shaping it toward what it could be. Imagination, when harnessed with purpose, becomes the tool by which one turns aspiration into achievement. It is also important to recognize that imagination is not purely about grand visions. Small, precise imaginings repeated consistently have enormous cumulative power. Visualizing oneself remaining calm in a challenging situation, responding with confidence in a difficult conversation, or persisting steadily in a long-term project strengthens the mind and subtly alters behavior. Over time, these repeated imaginative exercises produce changes in habits, character, and outcomes. Just as a sculptor chips away at stone to reveal the form within, imagination shapes the mind, which in turn shapes life. However, imagination must be disciplined. Like any powerful tool, if used carelessly, it can reinforce fear, doubt, or limitation. Imagining failure, scarcity, or inadequacy repeatedly conditions the mind toward those very realities. The individual who masters imagination is deliberate, vivid, and consistent, focusing on outcomes that align with values, purpose, and long-term vision. By controlling the direction of imagination, one essentially programs the mind to recognize opportunities, respond creatively to challenges, and move steadily toward the life they intend to create. Imagination as creation teaches that life is not a passive unfolding, but an active construction. Every reality experienced by an individual is, in some sense, a reflection of the images and ideas they have cultivated within. The mind, when harnessed with awareness and purpose, is capable of producing remarkable results, transforming thought into action and aspiration into tangible achievement. Those who understand and exercise this principle do not merely wait for life to happen. They create it. Imagination is the seed, and the choices, habits, and consistent effort are the nurturing water and sunlight that allow the vision to bloom into reality. It is through imagination, coupled with deliberate action, that a person truly shapes both character and circumstance.